From New York to our radio and TV audiences worldwide, this is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. Well, even before 2020 began, Eurasia Group took a look around the world and ranked as the #1 global risk the possibility that the U.S. presidential election this fall would not be seen as legitimate. And nothing much has happened so far in 2020 to really take that risk down. We welcome now Eurasia Group President and founder Ian Bremmer. So, Ian, take us back before this cataclysmic year. What did you see coming up? Why is this year different from 4 years ago or 8 years ago?
Well, because the country is incredibly divided, and we have a president that has been making every political noise that the election is going to be rigged against him, the dirty tricks campaign. And we saw that in 2016, that there was Russian interference that President Obama at the time didn't do very much about. We've not been able to handle having a free and fair election without external intervention, even when both sides were perfectly well prepared to play by the rules. We now have a situation, even before the pandemic hit, where that's much more problematic, where issues of saying that there's voter fraud happening, impersonation, you shouldn't be doing vote by mail. I mean, all of the efforts with a president who's well behind in the polls right now, but has the ability to help shape the outcomes of the way the election itself is put together. In the world's largest economy, the idea that the election will be contested and that half of the population will think it's rigged, even before the pandemic hit, we thought that was the single largest risk affecting the markets for 2020. Of course, the pandemic makes this a lot worse.
So, Ian, it strikes me that in 2016, I think most of us weren't really thinking that much about possibly the election being contaminated by social media and misinformation, Russia really trying to intervene in the election. Now we know what happened. We have a much better sense of what happened. Why have it been 4 years, and have we really made any progress in trying to reduce that risk? And if not, why not?
We've made no progress. One reason is because Congress itself is so divided. I mean, there have been efforts to get billions of dollars for proper election security through Senate. That's not being aired to a vote because the head of the Senate doesn't want it to, Mr. McConnell. President Trump certainly understands that to the extent there was Russian intervention, it probably helped him, and it didn't help Hillary Clinton. Let's keep in mind that the failed impeachment, Trump was impeached, of course, it feels like ages ago. In reality, it was just a few months, but it was not convicted by the Senate. He was acquitted. That was a process to engage in external intervention on the part of the Ukrainian government to politicize an investigation against the likely opponent, who now is the soon-to-be presumptive nominee against Trump in this election. I mean, when you have all of that happening, again, well before you talk about a reality where we're going to have a pandemic, people will be very uncomfortable actually showing up to vote. You're going to have massive efforts to do absentee balloting in swing states that don't have a good record of getting that done well. Certainly, unless it is a blowout for Trump or against Trump, the likelihood that we know who's going to win this election on the day after is quite low. The likelihood that it's contested is actually quite high.
So, Ian, there is some breaking news right now that you'll be interested in. It's not a big shock, I suspect, but nonetheless, it's important. The president, as you know, is down in Florida right now visiting Southern Command, and he now has made remarks and said that a Phase 2 China deal is unlikely at this point. I mean, a lot of people thought this was an uphill fight to get a Phase 2 trade deal anyway, but now the president is conceding it. What do you make of that? What does this do to President Trump's overall strategy of dealing with China?
Well, so David, when I've spoken to the White House of late, they've told me that they thought the likelihood that even the Phase 1 trade deal would stay in place through the elections was just under 50%, 51% that it would break. With the exception of the Phase 1 deal, David, every single piece of the U.S.-China relationship is right now heading into the toilet. And, you know, look at Hong Kong, look at the Uyghurs, look at American sanctions against the Chinese on Hong Kong in Senate passed 100-0. You don't see 100-0 in the Senate on anything these days. You see it against China. Look at technology, Huawei. Look at the desire to have investigations into the Chinese cover-up of the initial virus outbreak. The President Trump saying that we're leaving the World Health Organization. The South China Sea confrontation between the United States and Chinese military, also Taiwan. I mean, you cannot find an issue out there that the two countries, the two largest economies of the world, are moving in a positive direction. And indeed, the phase one trade deal, which heretofore had been a signature achievement of President Trump and President Xi, has been holding on by a thread. So I think the real question, you're right, I'm not at all surprised that Trump is saying there's no phase two deal. The real question is, does the phase one deal unwind? The markets won't like that. The corporates won't like it. And frankly, one reason why it's been in place and it stays in place is because the voters are going to be hurt by the additional tariffs that would come if phase one breaks apart. And I suspect that Trump really doesn't want that. You may remember just about a week ago when Peter Navarro, the senior advisor, said that the phase one deal was dead, that President Trump got on Twitter within a couple of hours, fairly late at night, and said, no, it's all okay. So I think that's the real question here.
So, Ian, it strikes me, I mean, we had a Cold War with the Soviet Union, as it was then called, but we didn't have a lot of trade and economic integration with the Soviet Union coming out of World War II. If we entered something like a Cold War with China, this is quite different, isn't it? Because this is the number one and the number two economy in the world that are fairly integrated, despite a lot of the stresses and strains along the way. How does that play out?
You know, it's different, and yet there are some analogies. The big analogy is that the United States and China are also, creating more data than other countries in the world. They have the biggest tech firms of any countries in the world, and yet they are functionally not integrated at all. And that's forcing countries around the world. The Italians just came out and said that they're not going to allow Huawei in their telecom process. You've seen the UK, Canada, Australia, a number of other countries are basically saying they're going to have to choose the American or the Chinese system. So that feels more like the U.S. versus Soviet Cold War. But no matter where U.S. relations with the Chinese go, I suspect that if you and I were going to walk into a Walmart in 5 years' time, we'd still be buying a lot of Chinese goods. I suspect that if we go to a university in 5 years' time, we're still going to see that the lion's share of $41 billion that comes from foreign students is going to be coming from the Chinese. We may kick them out of some of the advanced classes in AI in Caltech and in MIT, but I don't think we're going to suddenly say we don't want those students coming in. And let's keep in mind, the United States is still a free market, and much of our policy and our regulatory environment is captured by special interests that make money off of it. And there's a lot of money that still is being made by integration of the U.S. economy with China. So no matter how bad, I do think that buffers the question of how bad the relationship between the United States and China can actually get in a way that it did not between the Americans and the Soviets.
Yeah, Ian, just briefly here at the end, put these two things together, the possibility of questions about the legitimacy of our election and the real reshuffling of global politics here. What does it do to our standing in the world, not just with China, but in the world, if really there are substantial questions about our election?
There's no question that the United States is no longer seen as a leader the way that we have been. I just saw a stat earlier today that 9 in 10 Canadians think that they shouldn't reopen the border with the United States right now. And Canada, right? I mean, you see stuff like this. It doesn't feel like the United States is leading anyone by example. And that's an unfortunate reality because soft power for the United States has helped us get what we want. But I think we should also recognize there's a reason why the president of Mexico just came up and did nice with President Trump, and that's because the United States is vastly more powerful than Mexico. And most of our allies and our antagonists around the world still understand that the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency, still understand the United States is overwhelmingly the most important military player in the world. There are other things, too. So I wouldn't overstate the idea that the erosion of American legitimacy in terms of our representative democracy feeling broken and rigged is suddenly going to mean that America doesn't matter anymore on the global stage.
Ian, it is always so informative to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Ian Bremmer. He's the founder and the president of Eurasia Group. Coming up here, we're going to talk with Phil Murphy, governor of New Jersey, about his fight with the coronavirus. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for First Word News, and for that we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you very much. We are just seeing on the Bloomberg terminal some breaking news that a planned rally in New Hampshire for President Trump has been delayed because of Tropical Storm Faye. That is being rescheduled again. A planned rally for President Trump in New Hampshire being delayed because of Tropical Storm Faye. The president telling reporters this morning as he headed out of the White House to head to another rally that New Jersey could be hit pretty hard by Tropical Storm Faye. Some heavy rains in the New York City tri-state area right now because of the tropical storm. We'll of course continue to follow this story and bring you more developments as we get them. 2 World Health Organization experts are heading to China to try to figure out where and how the coronavirus pandemic began. Scientists believe the virus may have originated in bats and was transmitted to another mammal before being passed on to humans. A cluster of infections late last year focused initial attention on a fresh food market in the Chinese city of Wuhan, but the discovery of earlier cases suggests the animal to human jump may have happened elsewhere. Here in the United States, as we were alluding to, President Trump has resumed his campaign to get children back in school this fall. He tweeted this morning that virtual learning has been terrible compared to being taught in class. The president also again suggested that schools could lose federal funds if they don't reopen. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has cast doubt on his party's plan for a convention in Florida. Leader McConnell says holding the convention in Jacksonville in August is, quote, a challenging situation. He says Republicans will wait and see whether it's safe to go ahead with it. Florida is one of the coronavirus hotspots in the United States. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Yesterday, we talked with New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy about the coronavirus and the fact that it tends to be coming back in his state despite all that he and his state have done to fight it off.
The toll has been enormous, over 13,000 confirmed deaths and probably at least a couple more thousand that are suspected also to have passed from COVID-19. That's the awful tragedy. Our numbers have gotten a lot better. And so as they got better, we made the decision based on the facts and the science to begin step-by-step reopening our state. So we knew when we were doing that, doing it responsibly, I hope at every step, that we would take on more risk in terms of increasing the potential for transmission. We were comfortable with that risk. What we were not expecting was the explosion in cases elsewhere in the country. And so the rate of transmission has gotten a little bit uncomfortably high for us, just over 1. Today it improved slightly. And so we put in with New York and Connecticut a travel advisory for folks to self-quarantine if they're coming back into our state from a hotspot. As your colleague noted, and by the way, I welcome her to New Jersey as a resident, we are now requiring face coverings outdoors. Those are 2 steps that we've taken over the past 10 days or so. We've held off on indoor dining, which brings me no joy, but it's quite clear that this virus is a lot more lethal inside than it is outside. And so we're watching this minute to minute, and again, trying to make the decisions at every step based on the facts.
He was, by the way, welcoming our colleague, Caroline Hyde, who's just moved to New Jersey. But in addition to the human toll that the governor talked about, he also talked about what it's done to his budget. And I asked him why he felt so badly pressed with his budget, despite the fact that they will actually have a balanced budget this year in New Jersey.
It's balanced because it's constitutional. It's a constitutional requirement. But in order to get our budget balanced, literally only for 3+ months, David, we had to cut or defer $5.2 billion of expenses. The nut for New Jersey, we have estimated between mid this year and the end of 2021 is $20 billion. That's the amount of that's how overwhelming this crisis has been, both in expenses that have exploded and revenues that have fallen off the table.
Are you going to have to borrow money? And if so, what does your access look like to the municipal bond market at this point? New Jersey has not always had the best credit.
Yeah, we will have to borrow money. This is not either or, it's and both. And we'll probably have to put some revenue raisers on the table as well as we develop our next budget. The first place we'll go is the Federal Reserve special program that they've set up. And that'll be the first port of call. And we'll go from there. But this is going to be and both, borrowing, I'm sure, in the billions and needing federal cash assistance. And again, we're not alone. This is an American challenge right now. And sadly, we're seeing this virus explode around the country. The other states are in our prayers. We wish nothing but a speedy resolution. But it's a reminder that we're all in the same boat together.
So I don't want to borrow from Peter to pay Paul, as they say, but is there any possibility of increased tax revenues coming to New Jersey? Because you have a lot of people, including someone working at Bloomberg, I have to tell you, who are doing their work from New Jersey, where otherwise they'd be in Manhattan.
Yes, the answer, I assume, is yes. But, you know, in so many respects, as New York goes, New York City in particular goes, a big bulk of New Jersey goes. So I don't wish any ill will whatsoever across the Hudson to our friends, but there is no question there's been a big work from home trend. The real estate market in the commuting suburbs has gotten very hot in the midst of this crisis. Again, we are overwhelmingly all in this together, and we've done an enormous amount with New York, in particular, Governor Cuomo, Mayor de Blasio, and our neighbors in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Delaware. We are in so many respects, we're the densest region in America. We're all in this together.
We're speaking with Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey on Bloomberg Television and Radio. You mentioned the real estate market a moment ago. Give us a sense of both the commercial and the residential. You said it's hot. Are you seeing prices go up, commercial, residential?
Without question, residential, particularly in the communities that are easily commutable into New York. Commercial, I think it's too early to tell. I do believe that there is going to be a revisiting of some of what we had heretofore thought over the past couple of years of the stranded assets, the suburban mall, the low-slung sort of spaceship, three-story corporate headquarters, which our state was known for so long. There was a period of time here where folks looked at those assets and said, listen, the world has moved to a different place, a different paradigm. I believe strongly, not only will those assets be now looked at again with perhaps a different set of eyes, but they are being looked at, to be determined.
Finally, Governor Murphy, let's turn to politics, but everything is affected by the pandemic. You've just had a primary in New Jersey. The reports were an awful lot of mail-in ballots were used, and it's delayed a lot of the results. There have even been some challenges already. Looking forward to November, what does that tell us about what the elections are going to look like in this age of the pandemic?
A good question. Too early to tell, David, on November, but we tried in this primary. First of all, we moved our primary from June 2nd to this week, July 7th, and we went to a hybrid model. Everyone, if you were registered as a Democrat or Republican, you were mailed a ballot. Self-addressed stamp envelope, you just return the ballot. If you were not registered, you got an application for a ballot. And at the same time, we asked each of our 21 counties to have 50% capacity for in-person voting on election day, and every municipality to have at least one location. It's too early to tell for sure, but we think it worked out quite well. You know, we're trying to balance the sacred right in democracy to vote and to have every vote counted, and at the same time, the realities of public health today. So too early to tell on what November looks like, but we think based on all the evidence we have so far that the primary worked out quite well.
But do you have to take special precautions on the voter fraud claims? Because there are a lot of claims coming in about voter fraud. Generally, people think there isn't that much of it, but will you have to ramp up and actually invest more in making sure you protect the system in November?
Oh, listen, we did it in this primary. In fact, in their plain clothes, we had National Guard members up and down the state. I'm fearful, and by the way, we take every one of these claims seriously, and we run them to ground. We've had an enormous amount of back and forth with the U.S. Postal Service, not on fraud, but on delivery and timing of delivery. I'm fearful that the fraud point is a political talking point more than it is a reality. So I'll just say that, but we take every one of these instances deadly seriously.
Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's high time we got a market check, and for that we go to Scarlett Fu.
Hi there, David. Yeah, we're looking at stocks turning around from earlier losses, and it's interesting because it's not the usual suspects leading the way higher. In fact, if you look at the NASDAQ, it is lagging behind, and of the 5 biggest members of the NASDAQ 100, 2 of them are rising, the other 3 are down. So that's unusual from what we've seen in the past. Of course, the day started off with a fairly negative tone because Chinese government funds decided to unload some of their positions, cooling down that very hot market. Now, one thing I'm paying attention to are the technicals. Abigail and her fellow technical analysts call it a golden cross when the S&P 500's short-term trend line breaks above the long-term trend line, and that has not happened since late March. According to Sundial Capital Research, these golden crosses for the S&P 500 have corresponded with the end of every major bear market in the last 7 decades. Of course, this has been a pretty unusual bear market because everything's been on warp speed, but today feels a little bit like early June all over again. You've got cyclicals like energy and financials leading the way higher. Even Hertz is moving higher, and cruise line operators. I'm focused on the big banks here because, of course, JP Morgan and Wells Fargo will be announcing earnings early next week, Tuesday before the bell. Even with all of this, David, safety is back in demand because gold, while it's backed off from $1,800 an ounce, it is still up for the week. Copper doing even better because of supply disruptions, and plenty of demand there for TLT, the longer-dated Treasuries ETF. David?
Thank you so much, Scarlett, for that update on the markets. And a programming note, we'll go over all the things that happened this week and how they affected markets on Wall Street Week. That's coming up at 6 p.m. Eastern Time this evening. We'll be joined by Larry Summers, our regular contributor, as well as Dan Tarullo, former Fed Reserve member. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We have some breaking news now. We just talked to Governor Phil Murphy yesterday of New Jersey, and he said that they were having trouble with their budget. They were going to have to borrow some money. Well, he now has said he's going to borrow the money. New Jersey lawmakers and Governor Murphy have now agreed on a plan to borrow up to $9.9 billion. We asked him if he were going to have to do that. He said yes, but he's also going to have what he called revenue enhancers. I think that's a euphemism for taxes and fees. And so that's the latest news out of New Jersey. And now, for First Word News, we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. Florida continues to be one of the country's hotspots for the coronavirus. The state says new cases rose 4.9% in the past 24 hours. Bars, restaurants, and gyms began reopening in May, and weeks later, Florida began experiencing an alarming surge in cases. From Miami to Jacksonville and Tampa, hospitals in June and July have seen their numbers of coronavirus patients triple. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is criticizing an independent United Nations human rights experts report about an American drone strike that killed a top Iranian general in January. The report said the incident that killed Hassem Soleimani was a, quote, watershed event in the use of drones and amounted to a violation of international law. Secretary Pompeo called the report spurious and said it gives more cause to, quote, distrust UN human rights mechanisms. President Trump says he's looking at pardoning his former aide and longtime confidant, Roger Stone, who got more than 3 years in prison for lying to Congress and witness tampering. The president told reporters today that Stone was treated badly by prosecutors. He's scheduled to report to prison next week. Notre Dame Cathedral will be rebuilt just the way it stood before last year's devastating fire. No swimming pool or organic garden on the roof of the medieval Paris monument or contemporary glass spire. And to stay historically accurate, it will again be built with potentially toxic lead. That's the verdict reached by French President Emmanuel Macron and the officials in charge of reconstruction following that April 2019 fire. President Macron wants the landmark reopened in time for the 2024 Olympics. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, Vice President Biden is ahead of President Trump in the polls pretty much across the country these days, although President Trump still seems to have the edge when it comes to trusting him with respect to the economy. The former Vice President tried to address that yesterday as he rolled out his new economic plan, at least the first parts of it. He called it the Build Back Better plan. We welcome now Rick Davis. He's Bloomberg political contributor of Stone Court Capital. So, Rick, give us your sense of this. I guess it's a progressive plan, but it's not too progressive.
Well, it's populist rhetoric wrapped in a pretty moderate economic plan. I mean, he goes right after Trump on key themes like Buy America. I mean, basically what we saw is Vice President Biden's Buy America plan versus Donald Trump's Make America Great Again. And he goes after him on some really interesting economic issues like basically nationalism and building a strong infrastructure and manufacturing base in America. And we heard all those things from Donald Trump back in 2016 during his campaign, and now Biden is basically trying to usurp some of those issues for himself.
Well, that's what I find interesting, and you were such an accomplished political strategist, having run John McCain's presidential campaign. Is it a good strategy to say, basically, I agree with him on the issues, I just disagree with him on the execution? Because they basically agree we're not going to be big free traders, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. They basically agree they don't like China very much, both of them. Both agree we want a lot more manufacturing. So where's the disagreement? How do I pick between them?
Yeah, I think that one of the things he did, and I think he did a very effective job of this in his speech, is he basically tagged all this to the coronavirus controversy. And he basically said that Trump's mishandling of the coronavirus has made the economic downturn worse than it would have otherwise been. And so therefore, he's unqualified to serve another term, and you need to give me a chance to dig out of this economic downturn by, in fact, as you describe it, doing some of the exact same things Trump promised to do, but on issues like infrastructure and offshoring jobs. What Biden's saying is he failed to keep those promises, and I will actually deliver on that.
We still have almost 4 months to the election, which is, we keep saying, an eternity in politics. At the same time, it appears that Joe Biden seems to have pretty good lead, including in a lot of the battleground states at this point. Take us into the strategist's mind here. How risky is that to sort of sit on a lead? What do you do that you don't do something aggressive and lose it, but on the other hand, you don't just get complacent?
Well, I think one of the things that he's done with this economic speech is starting to fill in some of the blanks, right? He did exactly what you described, which is basically having a basement strategy for the first, 2 quarters of this year, where he respected the coronavirus limitations on his campaign and allowed basically Trump to either succeed or fail with his governance over the coronavirus and the economy. And basically Trump has failed. So now Biden sees an opportunity to emerge and start talking about substantive issues that he will do as a governing party and unite the party around some of these central themes. And obviously the economy is one of those central items that he has to convince Americans that he could govern as effectively as Donald Trump when the economy was roaring. And so I think you start to see that sort of filling in the blanks. So he's got a lead in almost every targeted state, those key states that will determine the outcome of this election. And I think now he's trying to fill in some of the blanks to ensure that that lead doesn't get diminished over the attacks from Trump and his surrogates.
Rick, if that's the blue team, so to speak, play it for the red team. Explain to us exactly what President Trump's strategy is right now. It seemed like the big issue this week was really school and making sure kids go back to school and get in the classroom and don't have remote learning. And then he's down in Florida today talking about drug interdiction in Latin America. What's the strategy there?
Well, I think two different things. One is he's trying to convert the school reopening issue as an economic driver. I mean, we know that parents aren't able to resume jobs as the economy starts to recover because they have obligations to their children at home if the schools aren't open. So what Trump is basically saying, as an economic growth driver, I want schools to reopen so those parents can be free to go back and resume their jobs. And so it's not really an education issue for Trump. It's an economic issue. And I think this is one of those things he's trying to push into the economy, knowing he has limited influence as president over what various school districts do around the country, but he wants to make this all about trying to regain economic growth. And part of that theme has to be brokered with the worsening situation with half the country around coronavirus, and that brings us to Florida in the trip today. Trump has decided to regain a schedule around his campaign, which he had sort of backed off on after a couple of bad starts in states that had a lot of coronavirus cases, and they're going to Florida at a time when they're peaking. Well, we hope they're peaking around coronavirus cases, and he's going to have to try to change the subject. So he's trying to talk about some of this law and order agenda that he's got, and in this case specifically, going to the Central Command in Miami and saying, hey, we're stopping illegal drugs from coming into these borders at record rates. Some of the experts will tell you that part of the reason that the level of drug is coming into the states is also a direct relation to the economic downturn and the closed borders on coronavirus. But nonetheless, it is consistent with his themes around law and order, and he's desperate to try and change the topic away from talking about coronavirus every day.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Rick. It's always a treat to have you with us. Rick Davis, he's Bloomberg political contributor. He's with Stone Court Capital. Coming up next here, we're going to talk with Senator Gary Peters of Michigan. He has a new proposal about what we can do about really getting manufacturing going again in this country. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The pandemic has done a lot of things, including exposing some of the vulnerabilities with supply chains around the world, raising a lot of questions about how we manufacture goods and how many we really manufacture right here in the United States. Senator Gary Peters of Michigan, Democratic Senator Gary Peters of Michigan, has got a proposal out now to address that we want to talk with him about, and we welcome him now to Bloomberg. Senator, welcome to Bloomberg. Before we get to your proposed act, I do want to ask, how are things going in Michigan? It is my home state, as I just told you. How are things going in terms of the coronavirus cases and the hospitalizations?
Well, we're certainly better than we were. You know, we were a very early hotspot to hit the state very aggressively. The city of Detroit in particular, and the African-American community in this state took the brunt of it. But luckily, we have been able to bring down the infection rate dramatically. It's starting to creep up a little bit just as the economy continues to grow, which is why it's important that folks continue to wear masks and maintain social distancing. But we're going to be watching it very closely, and hopefully the level of infection has stabilized. But you take it day by day.
So let's turn to this proposed legislation that you have to really address questions about manufacturing, and specifically, as I understand it, supply chains. Explain to us what your legislation would do.
Well, the legislation I have would create a National Institute of Manufacturing and focus on manufacturing as the ultimate goal, increase manufacturing. I believe you can't be a great country unless you actually make things, and we certainly do that very well here in the United States, and in particular in Michigan. We are a very important manufacturing state. And yet, if you look at federal policy over the years, there really hasn't been a coordinated manufacturing policy in this country. And if you look at our competitors, whether it's the South Koreans or Germans, they certainly focus on manufacturing. I believe we need to do the same thing. And we can do it a whole lot more efficiently than we do now. Right now, in the federal government, we have 58 programs that deal with manufacturing, and yet they're spread out across 11 different agencies. There's no coordination, there's redundancies, that wastes taxpayer money. I want to put it into one central agency that is able to coordinate it. I think we'll end up saving taxpayer money. Plus, we'll be able to speak with one coordinated voice as to what are the gaps? What do we need to do in this country to improve manufacturing and to make it a larger percentage of our economy? Because ultimately, those are good paying middle class jobs. The multiplier effect is very strong with manufacturing as well. And if we can put it under a organization similar to the National Institute of Health, identify where the gaps are, how government, the federal government can work with private industry to address some of those gaps, like skills training, for example, which is a critical element that needs to be addressed. And we're going to do a better job of increasing manufacturing generally in the economy.
How do you structure it in such a way that this new institute would have whatever clout it needs to get things done? So it's not simply advisory, but actually has some ability to make decisions, maybe even deploy money.
Well, that's why you need a strong voice for manufacturing. So it creates basically a chief manufacturing officer that would speak from the National Institute of Manufacturing. That key position and one voice would speak directly to the administration. It would speak directly to Congress. Right now, you don't get that kind of voice. So when you have 58 programs over 11 different agencies, that's spread out all over many different congressional committees, for example, there's not one voice talking to the president on a regular basis about manufacturing. So it really makes sure that manufacturing is always front and center. And it's done in a way where the industry has come together and the broad industry comes together, including having advisory council that can speak with one voice saying, if we want to increase manufacturing in this country, we want to employ more people in the industry and pay the great paying wages that come out of manufacturing, then we need to do this. And it's just important to have that one voice.
President Trump came to office really with manufacturing, building up U.S. manufacturing as being a priority for him. He talks about it all the time. I understand you're a Democrat, he's a Republican, but what do you make of his plans? What has he done? Has he really helped manufacturing back in Michigan, for example?
Yeah, I think we continue. We continue to lose ground in manufacturing. And one area that I'm particularly concerned about, and actually a report that I put out last year as the ranking Democrat on Senate Homeland Security Committee, we looked at it from a homeland national security issue. And we are actually dependent on foreign countries for the precursors to nearly all the drugs that we produce, critical medical supplies. I actually, in the report last year, said when the country experiences a pandemic in the future, we're going to be in serious trouble. And little did I know, a few months later, here we are in the pandemic, and it's clear we do not have resiliency in our supply chains. We've got to build supply chains that are certainly efficient and deliver products in a very cost-effective way. But we've also learned firsthand in a dramatic fashion that we need resiliency. We need to be able to take care of supplies that are critical to national security. And that's either the industrial base for the U.S. military, or in my mind, also critical drugs and medical supplies necessary for the health and welfare of Americans. And that's why we need to be thinking broadly about manufacturing and how it enhances not just our economic security, but our health security and our national security generally.
Finally, Senator, I don't want to let you go without talking about one of the big topics of this week, and that is schools. What's going to happen in the fall? Can we get back to schools? What's the situation in Michigan? Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, of course, is a Michigander, a fellow Michigander, although a Republican. What is going to happen in the Michigan state school system, and what do you think should happen?
Well, I think what ultimately has to happen has to be based on science. It's going to have to be based on the advice that we get from epidemiologists. Clearly, I think all of us would like to get back to a new normal, and going back to school is incredibly important. But I think we also want to make sure we do it safely. So I think it's about that balancing act. Again, as I mentioned at the top of this interview, we're taking it day by day as to how the virus is advancing throughout Michigan. Right now, it seems to be controlled, but we're concerned as the level of those cases go up. So I think we just have to be very wary about the future, but also understand that we do want to get back to a new normal, but we have to do it safely.
So, Senator, just to leave you here, let's talk about sports in schools. My crack staff here has informed me that Flint's Powers Catholic beat Pontiac's Notre Dame Prep in high school football playoffs last November. I must say, when I was in Flint, I was not in a Catholic school, I was a public school. But are you hoping to get the sports back up and running so you maybe can avenge that loss?
I think we all, I love sports like everybody. And as you know, Michigan is a big sports state. We all want to get back and have active sports. But again, we've got to make sure it's done safely. But I think I'm with everybody in the state saying, let's get back to the new normal as quickly and safely as possible.
Yeah, hear to that. Okay, thank you so much. That's Senator
Right.
Gary Peters of the state of Michigan. Coming here next, we're going to be talking with Richard Trumka. He, of course, is the head of the AFL-CIO. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, as much as has been done already for the economy, much more needs to be done. And we welcome now somebody who's really in the middle of getting that done. He is Richard Trumka. He is the president of the AFL-CIO. It represents over 12.5 million working men and women across the country. Richard, always great to have you with us. Where are we with the HEROES Act?
Well, here's where we are in general, David. The clock's ticking. The virus is surging, the economy's sinking, and the Senate's still sitting on its hands. And on July 31st, almost 36 million people are going to lose $600 a week unless the HEROES Act is passed. And that's going to be devastating to the economy. We saw this week that there were 2.4 million claims filed and 1.4 million regular unemployment claims, and then 1 million public unemployment assistance. Those are people that don't qualify for regular unemployment. And that shows you the big gap that we have in our social safety net. We need to get the HEROES Act passed now because local governments, if you want to go back to school, local governments need help with investing in social distancing and the infrastructure that they need, the PPE that they need. So the HEROES Act has to get passed, and it has to get back quickly. And unfortunately, Mitch McConnell and the Senate are just sitting on their hands.
Well, as you say, Richard, one of the cliffs that we're facing, a lot of people are facing, is that July 31 deadline on the supplemental $600 payment for unemployment. There are some people proposing, saying, look, we need to do something more. We have to extend it. But the $600 flat number doesn't really quite work because some people end up making more money not being employed than employed. Are you open? Do you think it makes sense to have sort of a graduated unemployment insurance program?
Let me just debunk that notion. First of all, those people that are getting something, the $600, they're also losing their health care. There's 24 million people that have lost their health care because of this as well. And it's trying to make up a little bit of the difference between there. It's not some kind of giant bonus. That $600 is the best spent money that we've had so far. It's kept the economy going because we've had 36 million people can actually buy things that they won't be able to buy if that expires.
So, Richard, one of the big issues of this week is reopening the schools. President Trump has been very outspoken on the subject. Where are you on that subject? Because on the one hand, it could actually help employment if we need to employ more people actually than we had before in order to protect the children and the staff. On the other hand, it could put some of the workers really at risk.
Well, it absolutely could. Look, teachers are fierce defenders of their students and their communities. And they're not going to allow us to hurt either those students or the community because we have an ill-conceived back-to-school plan. It's going to take a lot of investment to get schools started if you want to do that. Again, that's why the HEROES Act is so important, because right now local governments are laying off people because they don't have the revenue because of the pandemic. State governments are laying off people because they don't have the revenue because of the pandemic. If you want to get people back to school, we have to do it safely. And that means we're going to have to do the following. We're going to have to invest in social distancing. You're going to have to invest in ventilation and cleaning stuff. You're going to have to invest in PPE. You're going to have to make sure that there's tracing, tracking, and isolation involved. All of that requires investment because it's going to take more to do the same thing with students. We want to get back to school. We want those students back, but not at the cost of injuring them or the community. We will not allow another setback and another ill-conceived false start.
Yeah, and just briefly at the end, more broadly even than schools, where are you on basically shutting down more of the economy? We're seeing now record numbers in Florida, in Texas, in California. A city like Melbourne in Australia just said, okay, this is not working, we're going to shut it down. Should we be being more aggressive in going back?
I think absolutely that's the case right now. I think you have to follow the science and you have to follow the numbers. You see what happens when you get trigger happy or you let politics control what you're doing. States like Florida, Texas, a number of them thought, well, we'll listen to the president, we'll send people back to work without a real plan. And now we're seeing a second surge, and we're paying the price for that.
Yeah, it's very disturbing. Richard Trumka, president of the AFL-CIO, thank you so much. In our second hour of Balance of Power on the radio, we're going to be joined by Carly Fiorina as we talk about all those layoffs that now seem to be coming the second half of the year. And this is Bloomberg.